Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Kevin Smith, a member of the Commission on Cultural Affairs. We're so happy to have you join us today for the second part of our virtual event, Imagine 2020 Speaker Series, Keeping Your Website Accessible. If you missed part one of the series, not to worry, you can find the recorded event and PowerPoint slides on the Denver Arts and Venues website. We'll share that link with you in just a minute. If you were able to attend last week, thanks for coming back again. This will be a continuation of last week's presentation on web accessibility. Today's speaker series shares the same goals as our other speaker series events, continuing the conversations that began with Imagine 2020, keep the cultural plan at the forefront of our thinking as a community, inspire implementation by all of our cultural partners, and learning together. Before we get started with the program this morning, just a quick reminder to please feel free to share any surprising or interesting information that you are learning today via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anywhere on social media. We'd love to see all of your comments, thoughts, and ideas. And if you are so inclined to post, please use hashtag Imagine2020. And a reminder, if you missed any of these sessions, not to worry, they will be available on the Arts and Venues website at artsandvenues.com/Imagine2020. We also invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter Spotlight if you wish to remain informed of all of our programming, virtual and in person. Today's session, once again, focuses on our Imagine 2020 vision element, accessibility, achieving access through inclusivity to arts, culture, and creativity. I'm very pleased to be back for our second conversation about digital accessibility. As the Director of Marketing and Partnerships at Denver Film, I'm always looking at ways in which we can be more accessible. In this new virtual world, we are finding that our online programs have opened a lot of opportunities for us to reach new audiences, and that maybe haven't had the opportunity to engage with us in the past. And I think one of the main lessons we continue to learn is that this is an ongoing process, and that accessibility is continuously evolving, especially as it relates to technology. Roughly 10% of people have a disability that directly impacts their use of digital technologies, and lawsuits against inaccessible websites are becoming more and more common. The Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508 require us to provide accessible technology and communication for people with disabilities. But the process of creating and maintaining accessible digital communications can be overwhelming. This learning is not just about being compliant, but also providing equitable access to our work and offerings. This work is about creating accessible and inclusive opportunities for all. Last week, we covered the basics on web accessibility. Today, we're going to discuss how you can ensure your website is accessible and then keep it that way. Here again to help us is Fen Slattery, accessibility lead at Clique Studios, where they build beautiful things and work towards a more inclusive digital world. As a web engineer, Fen seamlessly translates the needs of users into digital experiences that minimize barriers to access. Welcome, Fen, and thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me scooch on over to my slides. 1 second here. Oops. All right, here we go. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it. We are here today to talk about keeping your website accessible. I won't go over myself too much more, but as Kevin mentioned, I'm the accessibility lead at Clique Studios. That essentially means that it's my job to make sure that everything that goes out our door is accessible to people with disabilities, both in helping our clients as well as doing internal education for our devs and designers and external work with folks like you. I'm also a member of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, from whom I have my certification in, a certification that is Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competency. Acronyms, hard to remember. I'm also a co-organizer of one of the largest accessibility or digital accessibility meetups in the world, based in Chicago. So it's a little bit about me. My goal for us today is to make sure you have concrete ways to improve the accessibility of your website, or build an accessible website to begin with if you don't have one, and to give you systems that you can put in place to keep it accessible. So the plan to do that is first go over just a brief overview. What do we know so far? What do we remember from last week if we were here? In general, the Cliff Notes if you missed last week. Then how do we create an accessibility process in your organization? How you can ask for help, whether that's internal or an external vendor of some kind. And then how do you create accessible content? A few quick notes for you. First off, live captions are available. If you look on your right-hand side, I don't know if it's mirroring my video. On the side there, you'll see a little chat bar. On the top, you'll see a little note that says for live captioning, blah, blah, blah. If you click on that, it'll give you a resource for seeing live captioning, which is great. You'll also notice just that lovely chat box. Feel free to ask questions or give your thoughts in that chat as we go along. I have a lot of time saved at different points for us to talk and go over questions you have. But also feel free to just chime in as we go, and I'll keep an eye on it and answer it as I can, or save it towards the end. But definitely say some things in the chat. You'll also notice on the side there will be little polls that pop up. I'll give you different little prompts and ask for your input. So just keep an eye out for that. I'm interested to know a little bit about who you are. Oh, I already told you about the poll and chat features. Look at that. I'm first interested in knowing, let me put this poll out, what your role is at your organization. I gave you a few options there: design, marketing, event planning, project management. Maybe you're a web developer, or I don't know, maybe you do something else that I didn't think of. If the answer is something else, maybe pop it in the chat. I'll give you all a little bit to answer. I love seeing the numbers come in. Cool. We have lots of marketing folks, about as I expected. Oh, lots of event planners, some web developers. Hey, my fellow engineers, hello. And a few folks saying something else. Yeah, feel free to put that in the chat. I'd love to know what exciting something else you might be doing. Lots of web developers. Very excited about that. Give you a few more seconds. I think someone in the chat has said something, but I can't see it. Ooh. SEO. Oh, SEO. There we go. Awesome. Event planner, volunteer coordinator, webmaster. You do a bit of everything, Kim. Community manager. Hey, Jessa. There you go. Jessa's the community manager for Clique. So, executive director at a small nonprofit. Oh, I wear a lot of hats, I'm sure. Ticketing and guest services. Oh boy, I love seeing all the things y'all do, because it's things I couldn't have even thought to guess as a poll option. Very cool. Okay, it looks like we have a big variety of the kinds of roles people have. A majority-ish appear to be marketing, lots of event planning, web development, and all you folks who, seems like there's a chunk of you that do a lot of everything. Excuse me, social media web manager. Cool, okay, that gives me a good sense. Thank you all for that. I'm also interested in knowing, let me launch another poll. I want to know if you have built something with accessibility in mind, whether at your current organization or somewhere else. Specifically, it doesn't have to be something digital. Maybe it's something in a physical event or whatever. The options I gave you are, yeah, all the time I'm thinking about accessibility. Or, yeah, here and there, maybe once or twice I've done it. Not yet, but soon. Maybe I have a project I'm working on right now that's supposed to be accessible. Or nope, I've never done it. Give you a little bit to let those roll in. Looks like a lot of folks are saying yes of some kind, whether it's all the time, my job is always accessible, or just here and there. And a chunk of you have said not yet, but soon. Well, you're in the perfect place. Good job. And for all you folks that have said yes all the time, I'm hoping I'm going to give you some extra juicy tidbits you can use in your accessibility work that maybe you're not doing already. And yes, a handful of times, you're in the excellent space to level up your knowledge. Love it. Okay, cool. Awesome. This gives me an excellent sense of who all is here. Thank you so much. And the last question I have for our poll to get an idea of who you are is, do you know how accessible your website is right now? And the answers I gave you are, yeah, our website's pretty good. Like, maybe it's not perfect, but yeah, on the whole, it's really accessible. Or, yeah, I know, and it has some issues. Or, no, I don't know. I don't know how accessible our website is. Give you a minute to answer the questions. Let's see. As this is about what I expected, so this is good to get confirmation here. I'm already so happy by how many of you already have an idea of how accessible your website is. Those of you who've said yes, it's pretty good. Awesome. We're going to make it even better though. Yes, it has problems. Again, excellent webinar for you to be in. We're going to fix that. And for all of you that said you're not sure, by the end of this session, I'm going to give you the tools and resources you need to have think of it like a temperature check of your website to get an overall sort of health check-in for the accessibility of your website. So awesome. That's a really good spread, because listen, if all of you said, yeah, and my website's awesome, well, then we just do something else for 2 hours, right? Okay, thank you all for that. That was super helpful. Now I know who's here. Okay, cool. So first, I want to recap a little bit for those of you that were here with us last week in our Accessibility 101 webinar, or those of you who weren't here. I just want to catch you up really quick. We talked about last time on Accessibility with Fen, we talked about what is accessibility, what is disability, how do people's disabilities use the web, why would you make a website accessible, and how do we know if a website is accessible? I'm interested, I do have these in the right order. Sorry, we're good. If you were here last week, I'm interested in knowing if you have just a tidbit of something you took away from last week's session, whether it's some fact you learned that you didn't know before, or some way of thinking about accessibility you didn't have already. Or if you weren't here last week, I'm interested in knowing what is something you know about accessibility already. Go ahead and answer that in the chat on the side. Give you a little bit to think and type. There's a little bit of a delay before it shows up for me, so. What's something you took away from our session last week? Or something you already know about accessibility? Ooh, okay. Here they come rolling in. I definitely think there's a delay between me and you. See, Alex says, instead of thinking about accessibility for others, it truly is for everyone. It's just about making the best experience for all users. That's an excellent takeaway. We talked about how accessibility is specifically we think about people with disabilities, but also an accessible site benefits everybody. Jill says, I learned a bit more about how to get buy-in from others in the organization regarding the importance of accessibility. Yeah, that's a really good one. We talked about a lot of different motivations for accessibility, and get excited, Jill, because we're gonna today talk about how to overcome some of those barriers if people are objecting to any of those ideas. So that I think will help you out even more. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's sort of recap a bit more too. What is accessibility? Short answer, it's designing things for people with disabilities. It's about removing barriers and supporting inclusion. What is disability? We talked about lots of different categories of disability and how they might impact how you interact with the world. We talked about they can be permanent or temporary or situational. How do people with disabilities use the web? We talked about assistive technology, how it can be hardware-based. We might use software to help us interact with the web, changing existing settings on a browser or an operating system, and relying on the content you provide on your site. Why would you make a website accessible? Jill, I think, hinted at this. There's a lot of good reasons, but we talked about ethical considerations, things having to do with, larger market share, legal compliance, and as Alex sort of mentioned there, it helps everybody. Also, it gives you better SEO and a ton of other reasons. On how do we know if a website is accessible? We talked about involving people with disabilities, user testing, the web content accessibility guidelines, and the conformance levels it has within it, and a lot of other stuff I can't summarize in one slide, but there is a recording available. If you weren't with us last week, feel free to check it out or forward it on. Okay, so we have a sense of what we know already. How do we create an accessibility process? With all this information, we know about accessibility, we know why we care about it, we know why we would do it, but how do we actually do it? Okay, so my goal is to help you, if you already have an accessibility process, sort of a template you can use to evaluate it and the current accessibility of your site. If you don't have one already, this is a really good scaffolding point that I'm going to give you. So to help tailor this to the folks that are here, I want to know how much knowledge your organization has about web accessibility already. There's a little poll on the side. I know we talked about if you have built things accessibly before, but the organization you currently work with, how much do they know about web accessibility? You might say, we have at least one expert on web accessibility. Heck, maybe you have a whole team, I don't know. You have some knowledge, but not much. Maybe you have a smattering, maybe you have designers who know about color contrast and a web developer who knows a little about code. Maybe your organization knows very little about accessibility. And I also gave you something else as an option, because I don't know, maybe you'll say, oh, all we do is accessibility, or I don't even know what accessibility means. I'm confused. Whatever it is. Give you a little bit to answer. Awesome. Cool. Okay. This is again, really a great spread. It looks like the majority of you say that your organization has some knowledge, but not a lot. And another chunk more say that you have very little organizational knowledge. And those of you that have experts, that's awesome. I'm going to give you even more support with that. Love it. Okay, cool. That is great. The other thing I want to know, because here's the thing. It's all fine and good to have organizational knowledge about accessibility, but if it's not being supported with systems and structures and organizational buy-in, it really doesn't matter if you have accessibility experts. So I want to know organizational support too. We're going to talk about how to gain that. You might have a lot of organizational support. The company you work with is like, accessibility, we love it. Maybe your organization is indifferent to it. Maybe they just don't know enough to have an opinion about it, or it's just not a priority. I worded this last one, our organization actively works against it. Maybe that's a little strong. Maybe wording that is maybe there are folks who are in power in the organization deprioritize it, let's say. That, we have other things. Let's say we can do that later. Like they actively work against it. You see what I mean? Okay, cool. So you either have lots of organizational support, or a good chunk of you said your organization is indifferent. We're going to fix that. And maybe it was my strong wording, or just you all have organizations that at the very least are indifferent about accessibility. That's cool. Okay, neat. I love it. It looks like a few more people are giving responses to that one, so I'll give you a sec, but very cool. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for answering all these polls. They really do help me out a lot, so love it. Okay, cool. Let's keep trucking. So these are the overall 7 steps we're going to go through on creating your accessibility process. This can either mean, like I said, creating a full process that involves lots of different teams, or Maybe it's just a process for you yourself, especially those of you who said that you wear a lot of hats. Maybe you're the only one who does anything with a website. However this tailors to you, these are very flexible steps. So let's go through them. In general, you're going to determine your motivations, find your people, that is people who are on your side and can support you in this. You're going to collect baseline information, build empathy for accessibility and people with disabilities, and gather support. You're going to define your standard, educate your team, and then you're going to monitor your progress. So let's dive in. Okay, cool. And throughout all of these, by the way, I would encourage you, if you're sort of in the mental space to do it, to sort of follow along and think for yourself how you would do each of these steps, and we'll talk about it too. So the first step is determine your motivations. This is really important, and some folks might kind of gloss over this or not think it is important when you're creating organizational change, but it's really, as I'll get into, it's very important. Ask yourself personally, why do you care about accessibility? Maybe you care about it because it's the law. It's the right thing to do. It's in your job description. You have to care about it. Maybe you yourself have a disability, so of course you care about it. Maybe it gets your organization more funding. Someone said you have to care about it. Your boss, or I don't know, me, this Fen person at a webinar said accessibility is important. Maybe you're scared of being sued, or lots of other reasons. But ask yourself why you care about this, why you're doing this work. Although there's not really a bad reason for building an accessible site. As long as your site ends up being accessible and people with disabilities can use it, like that's the end goal, right? As long as the site ends up accessible, then it's fine. You'll notice my tiny little asterisk there. There's one, if this is your reason, think about it, deconstruct it a little. Remember that accessibility work is an act of allyship. I mean, you might be somebody like me who has disabilities, so you're doing this for yourself, but you're also doing this for other people with disabilities. But if you yourself are able, this is an act of allyship for those of us with disabilities. You're almost, think of yourself like an accomplice, right? You're on the side of those of us with disabilities, helping us in our work. Accessibility isn't a thing that you do to like help, those poor unfortunate people or something like that. It's something you're doing alongside those of us with disabilities to make the web work better for us. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about your motivations. But on the whole, think of them. I find, regardless of what your role is, if you're doing accessibility work, at some point things are going to get tough, right? You might have to convince some stakeholder or some person who gives you funding, or someone, I don't know, who does other work at your organization, that this is important. And it might be a difficult conversation. You might be having to, what can sometimes feel like you're trying to educate somebody about why they should care about other people. You know, it can be a difficult conversation. And I find knowing what your motivations are and keeping them for yourself really helps when things get tough. When maybe you're having a difficult conversation, or maybe you're just finding others, there's no funding right now to be able to fix these accessibility problems. When things get difficult, I find it really helps to remind yourself why you're doing this and reframe that for yourself. To help motivate you as you go. Also, as we talk through those steps, I'm going to give you just my examples of how I did these things. I've been doing accessibility work for quite a while now, but at Clique specifically, I'm going to sort of go through how I created our accessibility process as an example as we walk through. So for me, that's a little icon of me, I guess, in the bottom right. So my motivations that I thought about are that I have disabilities, and people I care about in my life also have disabilities that impact how we use the web. I also thought about how it's the right thing to do. Like for me, it's an ethical consideration. And it's my job. On top of the fact that I care about accessibility, it's also my job. And that's useful for me to remember when I'm doing this work. In addition to advocating for myself, it's what others are expecting of me. So those are my motivations for why I do accessibility work. And if you feel comfortable sharing, I would love to know, as you're thinking about this, what are your motivations for building an accessible website? You can go ahead and share that in the chat. When you think about why you're doing this, why are you doing it? And again, there's no bad answer. Give you a little bit to type. Yeah, other common reasons that when I discuss this with folks, they'll talk about somebody said it's the right thing to do, and I want it to be my job description. Ooh, that's a really good one, Christina. I like that. It's sort of a not dress for the job you want to have, but do the work for the job you want to have. It's the right thing to do. Ooh, Angela says it's a fundamental core of who we are at my nonprofit. That's a really excellent personal motivation. Yeah, we're going to talk in a sec too about organizational motivations too. So keep that one in mind. Awesome. Okay, yeah, and like I said, you don't have to share, but think for yourself. Why are you doing accessibility work personally? Tessa says, in order to cut costs, my org is moving away from print marketing and relying on digital. So we really need an accessible website in order to reach the broadest range of constituents. Ooh, that's a really good one. That's good job, Tessa. You have thought of a reason that I have never heard of for accessibility before. That's really neat. Anne says it's part of the org's values. It means more artists can visit our site and apply to our grants and attend our events. It's the right thing to do. I want our org to be accessible. Awesome. Okay, this is the perfect segue into the next part, which is your organization's motivations. If your organization is already doing accessibility work, like a chunk of you said your organization is, determine why that's happening. And again, there's no bad reason, but as we're moving forward and seeking to either change or improve our process around accessibility, we want to know why things are happening the way they are right now. So determine what those organizational motivations might be. Again, like I said, I really can't emphasize enough. There's not a bad reason, but understanding your org's motivations will inform your work. So when I think about this, I'm thinking about Clique. Why we do accessibility work, what's informing that is accessibility is in line with our organizational values, as some of you said in the chat. Inclusion is a central part of our work, and accessibility is a part of including people. We also have staff with disabilities. Some of us rely on, websites being accessible. So that's another motivation for us. And the clients that we work with need accessible sites for their own, many varied reasons. But a big part of why we do that work is because we do work for folks who need accessible websites, which is a little roundabout. But that's why when I think about our organizational motivations, that's what I think of. So some of you already answered this a little bit, but if your organization is doing accessibility work and you know why, what are the reasons? I'm interested in hearing what you all have to say about it. Sort of circling back on what Tessa said, I kind of want to emphasize that a little bit more. I think that's a really interesting organizational reason. That because you're cutting print marketing and relying on digital, the site needs to be very accessible in order to reach the broadest range of constituents. Absolutely. I've worked with a similar client that is I'm trying to think of how much I can say. Regardless, they're think like informal education, like a zoo or a museum or something like that. And part of that is they have physical maps for navigating their space. And one of their goals and organizational motivations around accessibility is to have an accessible website so that way they don't have to have as many physical maps. Because if the site and the map on the website is very accessible, they won't need to be giving out as many physical maps. So that makes me think of that. Angela says, we are the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, run by almost 100% people with disabilities. I love that. Our key audience is the disability community. Exactly. And our secondary audience is gaining acceptance in the larger community. I love that. Yeah, that's a perfect motivation. Your audience is the disability community. That's why you care about it. Awesome. You might not all be like Angela. You might not all have a solid idea of your audience as it relates to disability, but that's another awesome reason. So like I said, regardless of what it is, you need to know your organization's motivations. I've also worked with organizations where their motivation for accessibility is they've been sued. In the past, they had been sued because their website was inaccessible, and so they don't want to be sued again. That's a really informative thing to know if you're doing accessibility work for your organization, because how things will shake out are different if they're being motivated by a lawsuit compared to other things. Cheryl says, we are committing to focusing on DEI training and work. For those of you who don't know, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Having an accessible website is part of that work. Yeah. Jill says, legal for sure. I work for a city government, and that is their main motivation, to not get sued. Yeah, it's really good to know. Yeah, the way that you'll talk about and frame this work, if it's about lawsuits and legal reasons, is very different from, for example, sorry, I'm scrolling back up, trying to make sure I don't forget your name. Angela's reason of your audience is the disability community. The work you do and how you do it will be a bit different. Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing that. I really appreciate all that. So for everyone else, think of your organization's motivation. Okay, so you've done that. You know why you're doing this and why your organization is doing it. And as a note, if your organization isn't doing accessibility work already, maybe try to think about why might they? What might be the reasons they might consider doing it? So step 2 is finding your people. You can't create organizational change alone, unless, I guess, you're one of the folks who mentioned earlier that they run their organization. It's them. They wear all the hats. Then I guess you can create organizational change alone, but you know what I mean. Luckily, you're not alone. And if you're alone at your organization in this work, you're going to find other external folks. You need people on your team, mentally and emotionally in this. You are not the only person who cares about accessibility. I promise. You're not, right? You need to find the other people who do to help support you and educate you, peers you can learn from. Those folks might be internal to your organization and they might be external. You need to find them. Another thing you might not think about is there might be people in your organization doing accessibility work and you're not aware of it. Those folks might not even realize that what they're doing is accessibility work. I especially find this to be true when I'm helping mentor other web developers in this. They'll assume that no one else is doing web accessibility work. And find when they look a little bit harder that there are actually more people than you would anticipate doing accessibility work. Sort of other ways you can, ways you can think about kind of who to look for. You might consider if there are folks in charge of planning events at your organization, they are likely very familiar with accessibility in the physical space, and very familiar with ADA compliance and things like that. And they can be an easy someone to sort of get on board with you. They might not know about digital accessibility, but their knowledge about physical accessibility is very transferable. So consider reaching out to those folks. Also customer support, whether this is, in a physical space, you're helping patrons to your venue, or you're, dealing with, customer complaints or whatever it is, the people who directly deal with, if you have customers at your organization or visitors or whatever that word is for you, folks who support the general public also end up doing a lot of accessibility work. They might be receiving emails such as, oh, I tried to fill out this form on your website, but I use a screen reader and I couldn't do it. Can you help me with it? Customer support folks encounter a lot of accessibility issues, and you might not think about reaching out to them. Also, designers will commonly be doing accessibility work, whether they think about it or not. Thinking about color contrast, thinking about readability, those are important folks to talk to. Also, if you have any internal diversity and inclusion groups, they, again, might not be familiar with disability work, but they might be familiar with other kinds of DEI work, so talk to them. Project managers, the list goes on, and you know your org better than I do, so I can't give you a full list, but think about the other places in your organization where people might be doing work around helping people, doing inclusion work. Those folks might be doing accessibility work and you just don't realize it. So look for those people. You might find that you're the only one at your organization doing accessibility work, and that's fine. You just need to look externally. Again, the purpose is we are seeking people who you can get advice from and give advice to, ideally. This should be a two-way street, but about how to handle difficult situations. You're also looking for people to learn from and educate yourself. You're looking for your peers, essentially, the folks who are also caring about accessibility, because it's really hard to do this on your own. You might consider looking at local meetups. Most major cities in the US have a digital accessibility meetup. I know Denver does, and they are excellent, and they run wonderful events, so consider reaching out to them. Meetup.com is a great website to look for that. You also might look around on LinkedIn, find other folks in your network who might be doing accessibility work. Talk to your professional network or organization, especially if you have a formal organization that in your specialty. Also, talk to disability rights organizations in your area. They might have working groups. They likely do have working groups specifically around digital accessibility. Maybe joking here, but reach out to Angela, the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. You get what I mean, right? Talk to disability rights organizations who are doing this work and see what you can learn. Oops, I just got a little error saying my stream might be lagging. One moment. Am I still coming through clearly? That was weird. Sorry, the big marker just gave me. Jessa says she's seeing us just fine. Angela, perfect. I volunteered you. Excellent, Angela. Angela says it would be our pleasure. Okay, thank you. It gave me a little pop-up saying there were network issues, so I don't know. Oh, hooray. I can definitely tell there's a delay. Cool. Okay, yes. Thank you all so much, everybody, for reassuring me I'm still coming through. Another great place to look is on social media. Twitter, I know, has a very strong web accessibility community, including folks like me that will share a lot of things in different accessibility related hashtags. And I can give you a whole list of great Twitter accounts around web accessibility to follow if you want some time. So find those folks doing accessibility work. The purpose is for you to swap tips and knowledge and seek support from one another. Find your people. However you find them, you need to listen and learn from those folks, especially if you are a person who doesn't have disabilities and you are talking to folks who do. You have a whole treasure trove of knowledge you can learn from folks. Your goal is to be both a student and learn from others and teach others what you know. And you might think, maybe I don't know. Oh, Alex says neurodiverse Twitter is a beautiful place. I have learned so much about myself too. Amen. Same thing, Alex. Same thing. Neurodiverse Twitter is really great. Your goal is to be a student and a teacher with your people. And I would argue a big part of why you should be doing this step is that I feel, maybe it's controversial, that there's not really a thing as self-taught. There's maybe being informally educated, but if you are somebody who is going and maybe you're reading about accessibility, right? Maybe you're at this webinar and then you are going and reading books and doing research. You're not being formally educated about accessibility, but I'm helping teach you, and the author of that book is helping teach you, and some blog article you read about accessibility, those folks are helping teach you. Whether you realize it or not, you're actively learning from other folks in this, and it's not something that can be done in a social vacuum. So I really recommend, if possible, you got to find your people. This won't work very well if you don't find your people. So how did I find my people? My local meetup before, when I was still relatively new to full-time accessibility work, before I helped run the meetup, I went to Chicago's digital accessibility meetup all the time. My people. Also, I was very active on Twitter and still am to some extent with accessibility work. On YouTube also, there are a lot of excellent folks with disabilities who have like YouTube channels about their experience and how they use technology. And that was a really great way for me to find community. Also attended a lot of different conferences, specifically in the sort of tech industry sphere, not even about accessibility, just other tech conferences and found the accessibility people at them. And at work, I was lucky enough to have other people at Clique and previous organizations I've been at who also cared about accessibility. I'm interested to know, and Alex already kicked it off this question, where are other places you can find your people? I'm sure you know, of course you know a lot more about your experience than I do. I maybe wouldn't have thought to put LinkedIn on here at first, but what are other places that you think you might look for people who do accessibility work? And while I'm waiting on that delay, I'll go over what Alex said a little bit more. Neurodiverse Twitter, specifically just a lot of different folks who, if you're not familiar with that term neurodiverse, it's a term that those of us who are autistic or have ADHD or other, differences in how our cognition works, will often share and swap stories and things like that. Give you a little bit to share if you have thoughts. It can also be, I recognize that some of these questions I'm asking are a little tougher to on the spot think about. But if you have ideas of where you can find your people, or maybe where have you found other people who do accessibility work? I'll give you a minute. If you were here with us last week, you'll know that I always feel like I should have some sort of elevator music playing while I'm waiting for responses, but that's okay. All right, maybe we'll keep moving. Oh, somebody jumped in and says, I attended the LEAD conference, Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability. Ooh, I have not heard of that conference. And you know that when I am done with this, I'm immediately going to go investigate it. Angela says, ask someone with a disability where they find help. I love that one. That's an excellent suggestion. Absolutely. Alex says, the chat boxes at any of these virtual events. Perfect. Heather says, local access groups such as the Art of Access Denver. Yes, perfect. I have to add that as a bullet point to these slides. Local access groups, A+, perfect. Yeah, these are excellent. I really like Angela's point about asking somebody with a disability where they find help, what resources they use. Love it. Okay, cool. Let's keep on trucking. Those are all very excellent suggestions I didn't even think of. So I'm so glad I asked you all. Okay, so what do we have so far? Step 1, we thought about our motivations. Step 2, we sought our people. Okay, now we're going to dive into more action. Well, those are sort of actions, but these are much more actions within your organization. So step 3 is collect baseline information. You need to know what's going on in your organization right now, regardless of whether accessibility work is being done or not. So one of the main things you're going to do is evaluate the website itself. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a little bit. But you need to look at your website and know the baseline level of accessibility. And I know, especially if your organization hasn't prioritized accessibility, that might be a somewhat painful step. But you need to have a sense of what is and isn't going well, because you might find, honestly, that parts of or aspects of the website are more accessible than you think, and that will inform things a lot. For example, when I've worked with clients on this and we take a look at what their website is right now, I might find when I look at it that, there's lots of problems with code and things like that, but the visual design is very accessible. And that's helpful to know, because that tells me that there's likely some designer somewhere within their organization who already has accessibility knowledge. Useful to know. Or maybe the other way around. Maybe a bunch of the code is really, really accessible. What the heck? That informs me about what's going on right now. So even if it's mostly barriers to accessibility, you want to look at what's going right. And of course, what's going wrong. But it's informative to know what's working well. But you don't want to just look at the website. It can be really tempting to just audit the accessibility of your website, and that tells you all you need to know. You want to know why things are happening the way they're happening. Think of yourself like an accessibility detective. That's me holding a magnifying glass. That's not obvious, whatever. You want to take a look at internal documentation you might have. Maybe maybe you have some sort of guide on how to update plugins for your content management system, or maybe you have a guide on how to create new images for the website. Look at those internal guides and see, do they mention accessibility? Do they mention words like color contrast? Do they mention things around legibility? Look for things that are directly or indirectly about accessibility. You also want to take a look at training materials. So these might be if you're onboarding a new volunteer to work on the website, or a new employee, and you're teaching them about how the website works. Take a look at those training materials and see again if they directly or indirectly mention accessibility. You also want to look at feedback that visitors have given about your website. This might be contact forms, these might be emails. If you have these saved in some kind of way, take a look at them. You want to look at like recent visitor feedback as well as historical. Again, that same organization I mentioned before with the physical maps for their space. There's somebody at their organization whose role is, just taking in and sorting out visitor feedback and getting it to the appropriate organizations. And we were really lucky. I was able to chat with that person about, hey, how often do you get a phone call about maybe an issue with the website that has to do with, maybe that person has a disability and they're struggling to use the website? Or how often do you get a lot of emails about this kind of issue, things like that? Because of course it's great for you to audit your website, but you want to know the actual accessibility impacts on your actual visitors. So that's really helpful to know. It also gives you a sense of patterns over time, common issues they've had, whatever. You want the baseline information. You want to know what's going on right now. You also want to look at how you have gotten to what this baseline is right now. So we're looking at training materials. We're looking at the website. You want to know how people talk about accessibility in your organization, if they do. So questions to ask yourself. You might ask, is accessibility mentioned in meetings? If there's a meeting about the website, do people bring up accessibility ever? If they do, what do they talk about? Excuse me, how do they talk about it? Do your designers consider accessibility? And maybe they're print designers. That's still informative. When they're doing visual design, are they considering accessibility? On your site or just for your organization, do you have an existing accessibility statement, or more broadly, an inclusion statement? Do partners that you work with ask about accessibility? Those might be, as my next question is, external vendors you have, but this also might be, for example, if you've received a grant, right? External organizations you work with, are they asking you about the accessibility of their website? Especially if you are receiving funding from certain federal entities, they might be very likely asking you about your ADA compliance and things like that. Do you talk with vendors about accessibility? And we'll talk about this a lot more later, but especially if you have an external web developer or designer who has set up your website, did you talk with them, or somebody else? Was website accessibility discussed with them? And existing contracts you have with vendors or partners or whoever it might be, do they mention accessibility in them? Are you guaranteeing accessibility? Are they guaranteeing accessibility? Whatever this is for you and how your organization works. I will often find, as I'm helping folks with this stuff, that maybe their vendors talk about accessibility. Like they say things about it, but it's not actually mentioned in a contract about the website anywhere. So whatever this is for you, look at how people are talking about accessibility. And this sort of feeds back into step one of understanding your organization's motivation for accessibility. You'll get a lot of good clues from collecting baseline info. Okay, so I mentioned taking a look at the accessibility of your website. And if I recall, a good chunk of you said that, yes, you know how accessible your website is, either for good or for bad, but that you do know. But a chunk of you don't know. It's also very possible that those of you who know how accessible your website is, maybe you had an audit from some external group or someone else at your organization, and you don't actually have a way to check it for yourself. So your website, I really, really recommend, especially if you're not, like if this is you if you're here at this webinar to begin accessibility work at your organization, your website needs to be audited. And maybe your website hasn't been audited in a year. It needs to be audited recently. Ideally, you need to bring in an external expert for this, which I know is not always possible, but this is something that you really shouldn't DIY. You need an actual expert looking at your website. Somebody like me who has a certification. There's a lot of folks who have been doing this work since before certifications existed. So it might be somebody without, and that's totally fine. It might be somebody at your organization who has expertise, but you need an actual expert to look at your website. There have been examples in different web accessibility lawsuits over the years where an organization used as a defense, well, we had our web developer just kind of run an automated tool and it said it was fine. So our website's fine, right? And it was shown that that's not good enough. You have to have an actual expert doing this work. However, there are ways you can get a sense to get an idea of what's going on if you're not an expert. I don't want to say, oh, you can't look at it yourself. That's not okay. But ideally, you need an expert. So until you're able to bring in an expert, maybe you don't have funding or you just are curious and you want to know right now, you yourself can do a basic accessibility audit. And again, I have a few asterisks on this. Ideally, you should have an expert, but this is a temperature check. There are a lot of different tools you can use and everybody has their different preferences. And if you like something else, go ahead and even share it in the chat. The one I recommend that you use, it's free. Accessibilityinsights.io. It's made by an excellent accessibility consulting firm in combination with Microsoft. They've open sourced it. It is a tool that is both runs automated checks on your websites. It's like a little browser extension. You click the button and it'll give you a little report. But it also gives you a complete walkthrough of like manual QA steps for checking all of the things an automatic accessibility audit can't do for you. In general, automated tools can get at best maybe like 40-50% of accessibility issues. And that's just because there's certain things we can't really automate, and that's okay, that you need to manually check. Accessibility Insights has scripts that walks you through the steps of checking them. It is excellent. It has so much help text. It's beautiful. It's I think it was released maybe a little over a year ago, and it's just been such a good tool that I love recommending to folks. So you can use a tool like that to do a relatively basic audit. If you're doing the full manual scripted walkthrough and it's your first time doing it, I would say it will probably take you, trying to think of a rough estimate. If you have a relatively small site, a few, half a dozen pages or so, it will maybe take you 3-ish hours to complete. And that's a very rough estimate. But you can use a tool like that to give you an idea. Doing an audit yourself, I like to say it's like taking the temperature of your website. You're not diagnosing issues. It's not the same thing as if you're concerned you're sick, taking your temperature at home is not the same thing as going to a doctor, right? Doing your own audit on a website is not the same thing as going to an expert. However, doing your own audit gives you an idea of how urgent your problems are in the same way that taking your own temperature gives you an idea of how bad your fever is and how badly you need to go to a doctor. You might find in your own audit, oh my gosh, there are tons of issues. Holy cow. And these are just the issues I could find. Oh, we definitely need to talk to someone. Or you might find, oh, wow, we actually pass a lot of these. Wow, we're doing pretty good. I bet there are more complicated issues under the surface I should talk to an expert about, but phew, it's probably not an urgent, awful problem. It also might give you an idea of what kinds of issues you're finding. Maybe you run Accessibility Insights and you go, oh no, there's 100 problems with color contrast on the homepage alone. Oh, that might give you an idea of some quick and easy fixes you can implement. The other awesome thing is Accessibility Insights gives you a bunch of suggestions on how to fix these problems. And don't worry, later on in this webinar, we're going to go over some of the most common accessibility issues and how to fix them. But Accessibility Insights walks you through all of that. It's so nice. It's so good. I love it so much. So Try a tool like Accessibility Insights. It gives you a temperature check of your website because our goal is to get baseline information. We want to know, where is your website right now? So how did I collect a baseline? This was less about when I started accessibility work at Clique. This was less about auditing our specific website because we're a consulting firm. We work on lots of websites. It was more about organizational baseline. And this is also relevant to you if maybe you're already planning on launching a new website soon anyways. The accessibility of your current website doesn't matter that much if you're getting a brand new one. But how did I collect a baseline? So, and as a teaser, I'm going to ask you in a minute how you might collect a baseline. So feel free to start thinking about that. So how did I collect it? I talked to different team leads. I talked to the head of design, the head of engineering, and I asked right now, what work are you doing with your team to ensure that their work is accessible? I also looked at, again, because we're a firm that launches a lot of websites, I went and audited all of our recent website launches for the last 6 months when I started doing this, and took a look at, this is our work product, where is it at right now? I also hopefully wasn't too annoying, but I sat in on other teams' meetings. I went to design team meetings. I went to project management meetings. I went to business development meetings, all sorts of meetings. They were fine with me being there, but meetings that I otherwise had no reason to be at. And I just sat and listened to hear how they talk about things related to accessibility. I also sent out a survey, which I think, yes, haha, I have a slide sharing this with you. I sent out a survey to all of my organization, partially because I like surveys. And also I wanted to know how people felt about accessibility, because I knew that in addition to implementing process, I was going to have to change some minds and win some folks over. So I wanted to know where they were at right now. I asked some of these questions were, what's your comfort level now with accessibility? Have you worked on a project that has a specific accessibility requirements? When you're learning about accessibility right now, what resources do you use? That question was so informative. And that kind of gets at Angela's point about asking somebody where they find help. I asked, designers, if you're not sure if your design is accessible, how are you learning more? Or a developer, where are you going? A lot of folks said that they specifically asked one team member. That one individual, I ask them and they tell me, as opposed to I go research it on my own. And that was so useful to know. I also asked, what do you do right now to make projects you work on accessible? The answer for a lot of folks may have been, I don't do anything. But for some of them, it was just, I just run this automated tool and I just assume it's fine. And then I asked, what questions do you have about accessibility? And oh my gosh, it gave me so much good data. If you're a data nerd like me, it was so helpful to know what people were thinking about accessibility already. I honestly cannot recommend it enough. If you have the time and the organizational power to just send out an accessibility survey, it's so useful. So I gave you a hint that I was going to ask this. If you, presuming you're going to go figure out your baseline, which I hope you do, what are some ways you might determine your baseline? I'm interested in knowing in chat. I still don't know which side it is. Whatever. I'm interested in knowing how you're going to collect your baseline. You know your org better than I do. How are you going to do it? These slides are also secretly a way to get me to drink water. Well, we're waiting on your thoughts. And maybe you already have a baseline, so I want to know how you collected it. While I'm waiting on y'all to type about how you think you'll determine your baseline, it looks like Anne put in a link to another arts and accessibility event. I'm going to click on it and look at what this is real quick. Oh, a cultural accessibility conference hosted by ArtReach in the middle of September. Built for cultural professionals to learn the latest accessibility trends. Oh, this looks so cool. Oh my gosh. I'll admit I've not been keeping up with other events very well while I've been in pandemic land, and this is really good to know. So thank you for sharing this, Anne. Okay, maybe we'll keep moving. People are probably thinking for themselves how they're going to collect a baseline. Cool. Okay, let's keep trucking. What's the next step? So our next step is we're going to build empathy and gather organizational support. You need to increase your empathy for people with disabilities and increase empathy across your organization. And now, again, you might be somebody like me who has a disability yourself, but we can all do a better job at understanding other people with disabilities and their needs. So can always do a better job of increasing our empathy and increasing empathy across your organization. Now, as folks have mentioned before, I'm trying to remember Jill mentioning legal things are their organization's main motivation for doing accessibility work, and that's fine. I generally find that if an organization has at least a partial, like if their motivation is also informed by having empathy for people with disabilities, that your work will ultimately be more successful and happen. People will just be more willing to do this work and not leave it till the last minute, which ultimately saves money. So there you go. Empathy, good. Empathy is good. That's my opinion. I'm so sorry to tell you, though, that this is the hardest step, which means everything after this is relatively easy. But building empathy is one of the hardest steps. It just is really critical, I find, that success as regards web accessibility is so strongly tied to organizational empathy for people with disabilities using the web. So we have a lot of different ways we can do that. I recommend a great place to start is better understanding the people with disabilities that use your site right now. So consider doing user interviews with people, just sitting down and saying, hey, I want to know how you use this website right now. Review past feedback you've been given. Talk to people, maybe if you do in-person events, talk to people about, hey, how did you find and sign up for this event? How did it go for you? Understand the people with disabilities that are using your site right now, both what's working well and what's not working well. Another great way to build empathy is to learn about why specific WCAG guidelines are written the way they are. So again, as a reminder, the WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We're going to dive into it a lot more later. Learn about why is this a requirement? Why does color contrast have to be this much? Who does it help? Do some more reading about why the requirements are the way they are. Or as we talked about last week, why do we have the ADA? Why do we have these laws we have to follow? And especially think about things that are tied to your organizational motivation. I recommend following disability rights activists, disability advocacy groups, read their work. I have some recommendations for you. Hooray! These are 3 books. I actually have a 4th book that I'm reading right now that I so far recommend, but some great places to start. Accessible America, A History of Disability and Design by Bess Williamson. The Disability Rights Movement is an excellent book by Doris Zames Fleischer and Frida Zames. Also, if you're thinking specifically about web accessibility, Laura Kalbag has written Accessibility for Everyone, and it is an excellent book for thinking about web accessibility. It does have lots of code examples, so I especially recommend it if you're a web developer, but it helps everybody who does web accessibility work. The book I'm reading right now is A Disability History of the United States. I don't know if the text is flipped for you, by Kim Nielsen. But yes, do some reading, better understand. Alex says, what's the title of the 4th book you held up? I'm gonna type it for you quick. It's A Disability History of the United States by Kim E. Nielsen. There you go. I spelled the United States wrong. That's okay. I'm sure you understand. So you can refer to that. Do some reading. Maybe watch some YouTube videos. I don't know. Do some reading. So I'll ask you this again, and maybe we'll actually keep trucking. But if, as I keep going, you think of some good additional ways to build empathy, share them. I have a ton more on top of these I don't even have time for. Oh, Heather says it's a great book. Oh, hooray. Thank you, Heather, for that. I've been enjoying it so far. So, Other book recommendations. No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement by Shapiro, Joseph P. That's a great recommendation. Love it. Awesome. Yeah, as you think more examples, put them in the chat. I'm so excited. Other books or I don't know, movies, YouTube, documentaries, YouTube channels, other ways to talk to people. I love hearing about that. I really can't recommend enough doing those things. Okay. I will admit, though, empathy and caring for other people doesn't always pay the bills. Luckily, it's not the only argument we have for accessibility. I really can't emphasize enough, though, how much building empathy in your organization will really help your success. But there are other arguments you can use, too, which we talked about last week. So feel free to review the recording of that. The slides are also available. The slides for this will also be available. So if you didn't get a chance to scribble down the book titles, don't worry. You'll get an email with the slide link. Really, I feel that you need both individuals and your organization to care about accessibility. Otherwise, it just will not happen. And they might care about it because of fear of being sued or legal reasons or whatever. But if the organization doesn't care and prioritize it, your work it won't matter. You have to build organizational support. Remember, again, there are a lot of different reasons for why somebody might care about accessibility. Remember step 1. So help other people find their reason. It might be different from yours. In fact, I would almost say that that's one of the ways I could summarize what my job is helping people find their reason for caring about accessibility. So this is one that I think people are very likely to have thoughts about. I want to know, if you have talked to other people about web accessibility, what objections have they given? Or if maybe you haven't run into an objection yet, what objections do you anticipate at your organization? I know when we discussed this last week, folks gave me some excellent examples that I can go over too, but I want to know what objections people have given you. They might be things like, well, that if we make the website accessible, it'll be ugly. It'll be boring. They might be, oh, that sounds like it's really expensive, or that'll take a lot of time and we don't have time for that. Or, oh, well, there aren't that many people with disabilities. It doesn't matter. It's like 3 people? We don't care, whatever. What objections have you run into? Oh, and they roll in. I love it. Angela says, when we push back on other orgs or government entities, we hear, I don't have time. It's too difficult. Why should I? Oh, amen. Yeah. One of the big responses I can give you for, Jill says, Angela, exactly. It's not as easy as throwing a PDF on a page. It takes too long. It's too much work. It never ends. I'm already thinking about too much before adding this in. Oof. So one of the big arguments I can give you as sort of a tool in your belt is that in general, the earlier accessibility principles are integrated into a website, either when you're making a new website or just when you're adding content. The earlier you prioritize accessibility, the easier it is to do. And the longer you let it wait, it will take exponentially more time to fix. The analogy I like to use is that adding accessibility to a website is like adding chocolate chips to chocolate chip cookies. If you make your website accessible as it is first being created, it's relatively trivial. It doesn't add much time to development or design, and it launches and it's smooth and it's great. Just like if you mix in your chocolate chips to your cookie mix before you bake them, yeah, it's easy. It takes like 1 second. It's whatever. It's fine. But if you wait until after your website has existed for a long time to try to staple accessibility features onto it, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be really difficult and demoralizing and weird. In the same way that if you have baked cookies, trying to shove a chocolate chip into a baked cookie will be really difficult, take a lot of time, and just be gross, frankly. The earlier you add it, it will take way less time. Let's see what else have folks said. Oh, Alex says it's a great metaphor. It's very evocative, right? At first it makes you want chocolate chip cookies, and then it makes you not want chocolate chip cookies. And says on one website we have already on Drupal 8 was designed without access in mind. I managed to get a third-party audit, but was surprised at the lack of excitement from my colleagues to implement the work. Oh, that I empathize with that. Thankfully, we're about to start. Yeah, I like specifically with folks who it tends to work really well with developers, some designers, but just, I don't know, depending on people's mindsets. Sometimes it can work really well to frame accessibility as like a puzzle you're solving. Like a lot of web developers, that works really well. Like it's a fun puzzle to solve. Like, ooh, you're used to seeing a website visually, but if you use a screen reader, you engage with the website like this. And ooh, isn't that an interesting code challenge to make it work with a screen reader? And that works out really well to like build just like, ooh, it's a fun problem to solve. So that works for some people. Justice says at previous companies, an unfamiliarity with the concept. Oh, that's a big one. Really introducing people. A lack of priority, a belief that the status quo is enough. Another thing that's very effective. Another good reason to do that temperature check, like the audit yourself, is to be able to show somebody, here's the status quo. Here's how bad our website is right now, and here's who it impacts and how it impacts them. Like, really good to know. One last one. Angela said, having to add alt text after the fact is so tedious and time consuming. Doing it along the way is a matter of seconds. Amen. And we'll talk about writing alt text a bit later, but in general, yeah, accessibility work is, if you're doing, I mean, just like a lot of things, right? If you're doing a small task that takes a second, right? And you're doing that task very often, you're spreading it out across all the instances you're doing it. But if you sit down and have to do 1,000 1-second long tasks, it's really overwhelming. And says, I would like to know how to use a screen reader to try to understand the experience. Any simple recs? I'm not very tech savvy. Well, Anne, that's a good question. I can send you a link. But in general, it depends on what operating system you're using. If you're on a Mac, there is an excellent screen reader that is commonly used, actually built into your Mac. It is called VoiceOver. You can try out launching that and playing around with it. On Windows, you have a few different screen reader options, NVDA and JAWS. But in general, there's actually, I'm going to give you some resources for learning more in a bit. PC at work. Okay, great. Actually, hold on to that thought, Anne. I'm going to give you some links for learning more later on. And one of them has an excellent walkthrough guide on how to try using a screen reader. So don't worry, I've got you. Okay, I'm going to keep on trucking for the sake of time, but thank you all for your excellent thoughts and questions in chat. I really appreciate it. So building empathy, how did I do it? If you're familiar with Slack, it's a chat program. I created an entire channel just called Accessibility, and it really built. I would share, links and resources about accessibility, and it encouraged other people to do the same. I gave a lot of conference talks and would share them with my organization. I shared all sorts of different articles and research because that's what was appealing to my colleagues. I met with team leadership and I explained, here's accessibility, here's why we should care, and understood their objections. I shared my own experience as a person with disabilities and my own, needs with accessibility. I also was just really loud. A thing that worked well for me is frankly just not shutting up about accessibility. That might not work at your organization, but it works I guess I'm just very loud. I don't know, but I just kind of didn't stop talking about accessibility. So eventually people their brains became saturated in accessibility content. Okay, so the next step, you're going to define a standard. So your goal might be, I don't know. You might have a goal of, we want nobody to ever have a problem with our website ever, which is a great goal, but that's not realistic. In the same way that your website's going to have bugs, just websites aren't set in stone. I was going to say they're a living, breathing thing, but they're not. But you know what I mean. They're evolving over time, right? There are going to be bugs. So maybe no one will ever have a problem. Maybe not realistic. You first need to set the minimum standard for your website. This needs to be something that is achievable in whatever time frame you have. It also needs to be measurable. You need to be able to say we are or are not meeting our standard. And again, there shouldn't be an aspirational goal. There should be a minimum, like a minimum acceptable amount of accessibility, because you're going to evaluate your website and the work everyone does against this standard. And sure, over time, you might choose to change the standard, and that's fine, but you need to start by defining it. So I want to know, does your organization have an accessibility standard right now? Does it even have one? A lot of folks I talk to, even though their organization might care about accessibility, there's no actual standards in place for what that means for you. And it can be really hard to implement accessibility if you don't know what you're supposed to do. So does your organization have accessibility standards that are communicated and documented? I'm going to remember to drink water. I'll give you a little bit. We're thinking about accessibility standards. Angel says, oh, yes, 100% or it doesn't get added. However, I think we don't always meet that. Ooh, yeah, you might have them, but they're not being met. Christina says, unfortunately, no. I'm hoping to start or create them. Christina, excellent. That's fine, because you're about to learn how to create them. Yeah, Angela brings up a really good point. You might have standards, but nobody's actually meeting them, which we're actually going to talk about in a sec here. So I'm gonna keep moving, but feel free to keep talking in the chat about if you have accessibility standards right now. So how do you define your standard? Heather says some, but it still needs work. Yeah, exactly. So I first recommend you look at the laws of your state, country, and industry. Look at what the legal requirements are as a place to start for your standard. Don't forget about the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act here in the US. We talked about those last week, so feel free to revisit that. If you are somebody who's based in Canada, Canada has its own much more recent specific to web accessibility laws that have been passed. I mean, every country has their own laws, but specifically if you or any of your users are in Canada, especially take a look at that. Some states also have specific web accessibility laws that are more strict or more just specific about what needs to be done, particularly California. If you are based in California at all, have locations in California, take a look at California's accessibility laws. And some industries actually have more specific laws, or licensing bodies might have more specific rules, if you will. I don't know if anyone here is in the airline industry, but they're a great example of an industry that has a lot more rules about web accessibility. Your licensing group, I know a lot of real estate licensing bodies have specific rules around web accessibility. So take a look first at any rules and laws you might have to follow, because that's a pretty good starting place for a standard. Also do some research. Are there grants or maybe funding sources you rely on that have accessibility requirements? Are there grants that you'd like to get that you can't currently get because you don't meet their accessibility standards? Also think maybe a little aspirationally, right? Maybe there aren't grants you're receiving right now that have anything to do with, that have an accessibility requirement as a condition, but maybe there's some you're hoping to get in the future. So potentially even talk to your development or fundraising parts of your organization and see if they might know something about that. So look at funding sources potentially. That's another great basis for research. And in general, if all else fails, I'd recommend considering the WCAG itself. Think about which conformance level you'll comply with. As we talked about last week, the A-level guidelines aren't really considered good enough from a legal compliance perspective. AA is sort of the standard in the US. I would also recommend looking to see which AAA guidelines are realistic and reasonable as a fit for your organization, and try to incorporate some of those. The default standard that if I am working with a client and they don't otherwise have particular legal requirements that are, different from standard ADA compliance or anything like that, we tend to assume a basis of WCAG AA compliance as our standard, and then we build off of that. You might also consider your audience and their specific needs. So are there certain kinds of disabilities that are more prevalent in your population? Or maybe the population of users for your website is on the average older and deals with more certain kinds of disabilities. But maybe your population, excuse me, has other identities that intersect with disability in a meaningful way. We talked last week about different groups that are more likely to have disabilities, but also think about the unique challenges that somebody, I don't know, let's say you do an ad, maybe you work for a nonprofit that provides housing for LGBT youth, right? Think about how if you are a kid who's LGBT, how having a disability would intersect with other issues they might face. And think about how that would apply to their experience on the web. Maybe an LGBT homeless youth is probably way more likely to be using your website on their phone as opposed to on a laptop or something like that. And think about how that would intersect with accessibility of your site. Think about your audience. That will inform your standard massively. So, and I'll let you answer this in chat, but for the sake of time, I'm actually going to keep on trucking, but feel free to answer while I talk. I want to know if you have a part of your audience that has specific accessibility needs that you either realize now, oh, we should consider that a bit more, or maybe you've known about that and you specifically think about that. I worked with a client where they were creating a device that it was like a little like touch screen kind of tablet thing that also had tactile inputs. Like you could feel the buttons on the touch screen and it could change. And we talked to them about, that actually is a really helpful piece of assistive technology for folks who are blind or low vision. It looks like you actually may have a lot of your user base that might, have visual impairments. We should make sure that your website exceeds WCAG requirements that would impact somebody with visual disabilities. So, think about that. So feel free to share in the chat if you have an audience with specific accessibility needs. I'm gonna keep moving though. Okay, so we have our standard. You've defined it. Write it down, document it. For every single project at Clique, even if the requirement the client has is just, WCAG AA compliance, I have a document where I have written down, this is the requirement for the project. You want it to be very easy and very painless for people to follow, very easy for them to refer to it, easy for them to understand it. If your standard is just WCAG AA compliance, write down what that means, give links to the WCAG, give links to tools that will help somebody meet that standard. You want it to be as easy as possible to follow it, because that means people will be more likely to actually follow it. Simple. You also want to create checklists for adding content to the site or updating content or adding new pages or whatever. You want to make it really easy for folks to find and complete that checklist. So maybe you have, maybe you manage the website, but your whole marketing team will add new things to it, new images and pages and events and whatever. Give them a checklist of, if you're going to add a new image to the website, you need to do this, 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 this. And we'll talk about some things you might put on those checklists later. But boop, 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 have a list. And give it to all those folks. Heck, print it out for them. I don't know, whatever. Make it really easy for them to follow it. Make it so, I can't emphasize that enough. Make it really easy to follow. Okay. So we have our standard. You also want to integrate accessibility into current processes and into current documentation. If you already have a guide on here's how to add a new page in WordPress, or maybe documentation for your designers about your brand guidelines. That's actually a really good place. If you have a brand guideline document, integrate accessibility into that. Say, here are our brand colors. Here's how to use them in ways that have enough contrast. Integrate accessibility into your current documentation and make it really easy for people to remember. Maybe try to be as annoying as you possibly can about reminding people. Also determine who's accountable to for that sentence that I wrote on this slide doesn't make sense. Determine who you are, who's accountable for accessibility. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else. The person who's kind of the keeper, the person in charge of accessibility and making sure your website is accessible. Make sure everybody knows who that person is. That, hey, you know, Steve, who also does IT, he's the guy who's going to be in charge of making sure the website's accessible. Make it really easy to contact that person with questions. Like, make it clear that this is part of their job, is to help everybody else keep the website accessible. And make it really easy to understand how they're going to evaluate everybody else's accessibility work. You also, as part of your standard, should identify accessibility-related performance metrics and key performance indicators, or KPIs. I feel very businessy every time I say KPIs. But have these metrics. This is another great way to convince the rest of the organization that it's important. And in addition to showing, okay, our website is more accessible and therefore people with disabilities are not struggling, you might have other ways of measuring that you're being successful. For example, there is a decrease in the number of phone calls and emails asking for help with aspects of the website. That would be a really a positive impact you can measure. I mentioned that organization I've worked with before, where one of their success criteria is, are there fewer paper maps being handed out on grounds because people aren't relying on them because our website is good and accessible. Have ways you can measure, is the standard being met? And you might have to get a little creative because they might be things like the examples I've given. So how did I do it? How did I define our standard? I picked a test project. I had one project that, okay, we have our accessibility process and our standard. We're going to follow it to the letter on this one, both to help introduce it to people, but also to test out the process I documented. I talked with all of our clients about what their needs might be, and that informed our company-wide standard. I researched established standards that exist across industries. I talked to members of every single team about, is this reasonable? Do we think we can do this? Can we go above and beyond? And I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of documentation. I wrote a lot of resources. And it might seem like that's a lot of work, but you are essentially, you're front loading that work. And so it's really easier for people to do later. Okay, I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I want to make sure we have time for everything. So step 6 is actually relatively easy. You're going to educate your team. You need to bridge the gap between your current baseline and what your standard is. You have a lot of different options for doing this. There's some excellent online courses. DQ University is one of those. I have links that are on a slide you'll see in a minute. You might bring in some external training. There are different organizations like myself. We can come in and help you to educate your team. Awesome books you can read that I gave you before, and there's a lot more about web accessibility. Meetups and conferences and webinars, which check mark for all of you. You're already doing that. You're at a webinar. You might do one-on-one meetings with specific team members to help introduce them and catch them up accessibility knowledge-wise. You might do a meeting with your whole darn team and talk about it with everybody. How did I do it? So I started small. I specifically worked on the engineering team's accessibility knowledge. That's the team I was on at the time. And they also had the most working knowledge. Remember the survey I gave everybody? The engineering team knew the most. It's also the team I could most easily make come to a meeting. So organizational politics has a role to play. And we ran a whole sticky note exercises. I asked people what questions they have about accessibility, what they think of when they hear accessibility, stuff like that. And this is a photo of some of those. They wrote ADA laws, ? Alt text, ? Things like that. And if you want to know how it went, one of our junior engineers said this: Fen put a magnifying glass, no, a telescope on the issue of web accessibility. Accessibility is never taught in web development courses. It's shocking how much this subject is unknown to aspiring developers and how many websites are being made without accessibility in mind. The engineering team, it was like I'd taken a blindfold off of them, and they really, boom, just accelerated after that team meeting with their accessibility knowledge. So really recommend team meetings. It worked great for me. continuing education I do. We do monthly accessibility check-ins. There's several Slack channels about accessibility topics. I run and attend meetup events. There are specific people on each team that are like the accessibility champion for that team at Clique. I have people shadow the work I do and sit in with me when I'm auditing a site. I also, I like to say that my goal is to be like Mary Poppins. I encourage other people to answer accessibility questions that aren't me. I say that like my goal is for me to not need to be in this meeting. I'm like Mary Poppins. Once you don't need me anymore, I leave. I'm not going to leave, but you know what I mean. I want to empower people to learn to fish instead of fishing for them. Okay, we're going to skip this question. I apologize. I'm running a little behind time. So we're going to keep going. Educating your team. A note, if you'll be leading the accessibility effort at your organization, especially long-term, you really need to level up your own education about this. It is a-okay to expose the fact that you're not an expert yet, maybe, and that's okay. That you need to try to stay ahead of the needs of your organization. I recommend you might consider a certification, but they're not 100% necessary. It's just a really good path to learning and showing that you have that education. Okay, so last step, and it's one a lot of people skip. We're going to monitor our conformance against the standard. So compare, maybe you've done all this educational work, you've communicated all these things, and now people are doing the work. Compare the progress you've made to your standard. How's it going? You need to take a look at deliverables for your website. Maybe it's new pages that people have added, or new content that's been added, or documentation about the website. Whatever those deliverables are, when they are created, you need to take a look at them. So if somebody's added a new page, do QA on it. Ideally before it launches so you catch issues, but audit things as they are being created and before they are launched to the public. A great way to do that, if you have a QA process for your website right now, integrate accessibility into it. It's actually, if there's already a QA process, just add an extra step of send it to, this person. In my case, it's send it to Fen. Fen will check it for accessibility and then tell you it's good or not and send it back. It's a really easy model, especially for web developers to follow if you think about it as QA. Also, a great way to monitor conformance is to do similarly to what you did before, is be present in meetings and be present wherever people are asking questions online. If that's in your, maybe there's a group email that's going around or a Slack channel or whatever, a forum you might have. Pay attention to what questions people are asking and take note. What's being mentioned around accessibility? How are people talking about accessibility? Pay attention to that. Pay attention to what's being created. Sorry for the typo there, but also how people are creating things. The process and the results both matter. And you want to be able to make adjustments to that process and those results as you go. How do I do this? I have check-ins with team leads and I ask specifically about their team and team members. I keep mentioning Slack channels. They work really well for me. I do QA on every design and wireframe and new pages and bug fixes and sites. Everything has an accessibility QA. For our website personally, I also do a quarterly audit of the whole site because content changes over time. I will also sometimes do post-launch audits for a new website and do progress check-ins with engineers and so much stuff. But really, accessibility is it's a process. You can't just say, okay, we made the website accessible. We're done. Time to never think about it again. You have to monitor it over time. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm going to skip this question again because we also talked about a lot of good ways to monitor accessibility. Whew. Okay. I'm going to take a drink of water. If you have any questions so far, go ahead and pop them in the chat for me. Otherwise, we're going to move on to asking for help. This is a shorter section, don't worry. Okay. So how do we ask for help with all of this? We talked about finding your people and gathering support and all that. So I don't mean in asking somebody for help in an individual way. I more mean organizational help. How do you ask for help? I just said this. Why would you ask for help? So remember step 3, collecting baseline information, auditing the current site. Remember how I said ideally an expert should audit your site for you if you're not an expert? Ha ha ha. That's one reason you might ask for help. Maybe you also have skills to fix some of the accessibility problems you found on a site, but not all of them. And don't worry, we're going to talk in a little bit about common problems and how to fix them. But maybe you don't know how to fix all of these. You don't have the skills. Or maybe you have an external vendor that does parts of your website for you, or you're looking for a new website. And do not worry, this is not me saying, ask Clique, we'll do it. This isn't a sales pitch, but maybe you're looking for a vendor for a new website and you need to talk to them about accessibility. Or maybe you just want training. Maybe you kind of understand this, but you want an expert to come in and help you understand it even better. I want to know, as we talk through this, if you have sought accessibility help before, whether this is hiring an external vendor to do accessibility work, to remediate your website, to audit it, to make design changes, to do training, whatever it is. If you have talked to somebody externally about accessibility before, pop it in the chat and I'll integrate it as we talk. Okay. So I've given you some questions in all of these cases. Here are questions I recommend you ask potential vendors. If you are looking for a new website or a revamp of your current website, of course, there's a lot of things you're going to ask. There's a lot of things you want to know when you're getting a new website, but specifically as regards accessibility, when you are considering people who might create a new website, you need to ask, do you have experience in building accessible websites? And you should be asking for examples and ideally references for these things. And you might already be asking for references in the first place. So ask about accessibility. Ask, what standards do you follow for accessibility? And which ones do you recommend we follow? What kinds of training and certifications do your engineers or designers or whatever it is have in web accessibility? How will you ensure that our website is accessible, both at launch and over time? And then what questions do you have for us about accessibility and our website? The vendor you're talking to should be able to answer these questions for you if they have accessibility experience. And they should be, you can also kind of evaluate these against a lot of the things we've talked about. They should be able to talk about training engineers. They should be able to talk about standards they follow. They should be able to give you a recommendation for what standards you should follow. Maybe you have an existing website and you're looking for it to be improved, or I don't know, new features added or something like that. Or it's just you need it remediated. Maybe you know there are a lot of accessibility issues and you need them fixed. Questions you should be asking a potential external person who's going to help you. You should ask, what are some of the types of accessibility issues you see on our website currently? And now, I mean, don't ask for a whole free, do all this for free. That's not what I mean. But ask them in general, what are some of the issues you're seeing just at a high level? You should ask, what kinds of training and certifications do you have? You might ask, what's your QA process? How do you know that it's accessible once you've done it? You should know if that vendor is only able to make changes to the design or code, or what kinds of changes they can make. Who will be responsible for editing and adding content like video captions and alt text? We're going to talk about how to make that in a sec. You should ask, have they done an accessibility remediation before? Have they fixed accessibility issues on a website? And that same thing, what questions they might have for you about accessibility in your website. They should be able to answer all of these. They should have an answer that is satisfactory to you about all of this. Maybe you're just looking for training. Maybe you're looking for an external org to come in and do training for you. And there are a lot of excellent accessibility organizations that can do that. If it is specifically about web accessibility, you should be asking, again, what are some of the types of issues you see on our current website? What background and experience do you have in accessibility training? Will there be a recording of some kind, or documents or slides or notes we can refer to afterwards? If we have follow-up questions for you, can we ask them? How should we send them? Will this training be custom for us and our circumstances and our organization, or is it kind of generic? And again, what questions do you have for us about accessibility in our organization? But a trainer who is training you about accessibility should be able to answer all of these questions. And last, if you are looking for an audit specifically, so you're not looking to have somebody fix your website, but you're looking to get your baseline information of how accessible is our website, and you are talking to an expert in that, they should be able to answer, what standards are you evaluating the website against? What's your background and experience in doing this? This one's a slightly trick question of, will you be using WCAG 2.1 or 2.0? 2.0 is old and not valid anymore. They should be using 2.1. There are some orgs that are not experts in this who will still say that they're using the old one. What assistive technology will you be using as part of the audit of the site, like a screen reader? You don't want them to be simulating all of this. You want them to actually use the assistive tech. Do you involve actual people with disabilities in your testing? How will you share the audit results? Is it a meeting, a PowerPoint, a document? What is it? Will we be able to ask follow-up questions? Will you be making recommendations or just telling us what's wrong with the site? Again, if somebody is giving you a website accessibility audit, they should be able to answer all of these questions for you. And if they are not able to answer some of them, you should consider talking to someone else. Okay, so again, that was sort of rapid fire. These slides will be sent out as soon as this webinar is done to your emails, and you can refer to those questions as much as you want when you're looking for a vendor. Okay, the last part. I'm going to take another drink of water, and then we're going to keep going. We're going to talk about how to make accessible content for your website. And again, feel free to ask any questions right now in the chat if you have them. Okay, cool. Thank you all for sticking with me. I know this is a long webinar, so I really appreciate it. Okay, how do we create accessible content? How do you do it? Well, let's go over it. I put it on a red slide also. How do I create accessible content? Some general resources for you. And this, I remember earlier, I told somebody I would answer a question with a slide of links. This is that slide. Here's some general resources for you to learn more, because I certainly could not even try to go over every single possible accessibility issue. You want to refer to the WCAG itself. This link I've given you is to the quick reference, which is my favorite way to read the WCAG. Also, WebAIM is an awesome organization that does web accessibility work that has so many cool free training resources. I love them. They are, if you're going to only go to one site on this list, actually go to all of them. I can't even tell you a specific one. That's a really great one that has a lot of introductory and deeper materials. The Accessibility Project, that's A11Y. A11Y is a common acronym for accessibility because it's the letter A and then 11 letters and then the letter Y, because it takes up too many characters on Twitter. DQ University, this is a paid resource, but it's a bunch of excellent videos and courses you can take around accessibility. It's excellent. We also have a specific resource that I really recommend that breaks down web accessibility by what your role is. So if you create content, here's some specific things. If you're a designer, here are specific things. It's cliquestudios.com/accessibility. So take a look at that. But yeah, these are all great resources for learning more. So I'm going to go over right now things that are WCAG 2.1 AA standards, which is, again, that recommended minimum legal compliance standard. These are also the things specifically related to content creation, because I do not want to bore all of you who are not programmers with things that are only about code. It's not that helpful. These are also things that are common issues, things that are common problems with accessibility that I will see on websites. I've also scoped this to things that don't require really changing much code, because I'm making the assumption that if you're a marketer using a content management system, you probably are not able to change a lot of overall code. These are also things that don't require updating your designs more than just changing the color of this piece of text. You don't have to redesign your whole website for any of these. These are also the things that are easy for me to explain quickly. I tried to pick out the things that would be best to give you in this setting. A note, I am not going to cover any specific content management system, like how to do this in WordPress or how to do this in Ruby on Rails or how to whatever. Different content management systems are very different, and some are way more accessible out of the box than others, way more. Also, some content management systems give you way more control than others. I'm going to assume that you're working with a content management system that is relatively flexible, that lets you edit and add things, that gives you plugins. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a jumping off point. Think of this as some like low-hanging fruit, quick fixes. These aren't how to make your website perfect. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. I'm unfortunately going to skip my questions for you for the sake of time, but that's okay. So, oh, wow, we're going to dive in. You'll notice I've also referred to these by their specific WCAG guideline number if you want to refer to that. The first thing we're going to talk about is alternative text for images, which is good old 1.1.1. So what does this mean? Alternative text describes the content and function of a non-text element, whether that's a video or an icon or an image or audio or whatever it is. And in this specific case, I'm going to talk about images on your site. We need to add text that describes those images. And why do we need that? Well, it's very important for screen reader users who can't, or blind or visually impaired users who can't see the image. It's also really useful for those of us with cognitive or emotional disabilities who can maybe see the image, but might not understand what is going on or understand why it's important. And sometimes we'll rely on alternative text to understand the purpose of the image. In addition to that, alternative text also helps users with a bad internet connection. You'll see alt text loaded on a page instead of an image. If maybe the image is broken, it's not loading for some reason, or you just have really crappy internet and it won't load. Alt text is also useful for SEO, search engine optimization. SEO or alt text should be used for accessibility purposes, but when you do it right, it also helps your SEO. And luckily, this is actually really easy and really quick. As long as you know the rules on how to write alt text, it's really easy to do, as long as you're not having to sit down and do it for 1,000 images at once. And when you do this, as you add the images to your site, it doesn't take much time. In HTML, in an image tag on a website, there will be an alt attribute, and that's where alt text goes. Nearly all content management systems have an option where you can type in the alternative text when you add an image. So you don't have to go editing code or anything like that. When you add the image, it'll often say something like alternative text or caption or whatever. And you just type it right there. Instead of me spending an hour explaining to you how to write alt text, I decided to just save everybody's time and give you a link to our resource on how to write alt text. It's really simple and straightforward. Essentially, though, you're going to describe what's important about the image in the context it's in, and that goes in that field. And alt text not being present is a huge, huge barrier to accessibility on your website. And alt text that is written correctly is easy to do and makes a world of difference to a lot of folks. So instead of deep diving, I'm just going to give you a link of cliquestudios.com/alt-text. Also, because it's really very helpful to just refer to as you're writing it. So take a look. You need to have alt text. It's important. Another thing you should be doing is having captions on your videos. So captions are just synchronized text on the video. These are absolutely critical for folks who are deaf or people with hearing loss. Also, those of us with auditory processing symptoms as a result of other disabilities can be a common thing with autism, where it can be sometimes difficult, even though we can hear the audio, it can be difficult to parse spoken words. This also benefits if a user doesn't have speakers or headphones or something and they can't hear it, but also maybe the language spoken in your video isn't a language they're completely proficient in, so the captions help them. So captions are not too difficult to write, but if you are not experienced in writing captions, it takes forever. It takes in my opinion, I hate writing captions. It takes a long time. Angela had a note about alt text. If you could focus on why you put the image in the content, you can use that for your alt text. Yes, a very good point. Excellent. I think that's one of the tips I have in the article. Think about why you have put the image on the site, why you chose that image, and that will inform what you write. Thank you so much for that ad, Angela. Captions, they can take a long time to do yourself because when you think about it, you're writing text for every word that is said in the video, and you're writing it synchronized with the time. Some folks find it easy to do, and I'm so happy those people find it easy. I'm not one of those people. YouTube, I'm presuming that a lot of you will use YouTube for your video hosts. Vimeo does similar things. YouTube has an auto captioning feature that you can turn on for your videos. Their automatic captions are fine, not really. They are usually better than not having any captions at all, but honestly, a lot of times they can be worse than having no captions. They're not really sufficient. I do not recommend only using auto captioning. Instead, YouTube does have a tool that lets you author captions in their back end of where you would upload your video on YouTube. And it helps you, it'll give you like the automated generated captions, and you can go through and edit them, which is awesome. I really recommend that. I personally, because you can tell I really don't like writing captions. I use a service like rev.com, where they are awesome and they will write captions for you. You can have them use an automated tool for it, but I really recommend the ones where it's a person going through and captioning your video. Last time I checked, it's $1 per minute of video. It's really inexpensive. And it's super quick turnaround time. With short videos, I usually get the results back in like half an hour. I don't know how it's so quick, but there are awesome captioning services you can use. I really recommend. But if you want to build your skill in captioning videos yourself, that's great too. Use YouTube's captioning authoring tool and go through and write them in there. It's great. And it has a whole guide on how to write captions. Love it. But I really recommend just paying $1 per minute of video and having captions added for you. Okay, keeping on moving. Sensory characteristics is another quick and easy fix. So you don't want to describe things on your website in content you write you don't want to describe them using like their shape or their color or their size or whatever. You don't want to say, click the yellow button below, click the yellow button to the right, or the largest image on the page shows this thing. You don't want to sensory characteristics. This is important for blind or low vision users who like can't see that image is larger, or a colorblind user who can't tell that button is yellow. Also for folks with like different sensory processing symptoms like we talked about before. This benefits also though people who are on mobile, so your site looks different for them. Maybe the yellow button is below, not above. It's also people who are using your website in an unintended way. So like if they have saved a page on your website to like a bookmarking tool like Pocket, or they're viewing it in their RSS feed, and that'll strip away a lot of the styling of your website. We don't want to rely on describing things in sensory ways. And this is actually really easy to avoid, to the point where some of you might be sitting here thinking, well, I don't ever do that to begin with. It's easy to avoid. It's really easy and easy to fix if you've done it. This doesn't mean you can't describe things using sensory characteristics. So you can still say that the button is yellow. That's fine, but it shouldn't be the only thing you use. You should describe it as the yellow button that says sign in, whatever, right? Describe it in additional ways. You can also describe things with an order. That's fine. So you could say the third image depicts my dog, blah, 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 whatever. Because order is something that you can perceive in lots of different ways that aren't just visual. So a screen reader user can still know the order of things on a page, right? Just don't rely on only sensory characteristics to describe things on your site. Color, though. Oh, this is a big one. You do not want to use color as the only way of communicating information. So we might often use red to describe things as like, there's an error here. You want to not only use the color red to indicate an error. This is super important for blind or low vision users, but also very much for colorblind users who might not perceive the color in the way you're intending. It also helps people who have a different primary language than the language of your site. That might impact just like their cultural, or not even language, but just who have a different cultural association with colors than you might. And I'd say this one's pretty easy too, easy to medium difficulty maybe. The biggest way we'll see this on the web is using green to mean like this is good or correct or yes, like, or on a spreadsheet, like this cell is green, it's good. And we'll use red to mean like it's no, or it's bad, or it's an error, or whatever. Red-green color blindness is the most common kind of color blindness. So red and green is the only ways to communicate the difference between information is especially bad. This doesn't mean you can't use color though. It just shouldn't be the only way you communicate information. So consider if you have an error message, an error, and you're trying to mark that this input is something wrong with it. Try also just using the word error. Or maybe you're trying to indicate rows on something like this one's bad. We lost money in this row or whatever, right? Maybe use an icon to indicate that, like an exclamation mark or an X. Or maybe use a pattern or words. Just use words in addition to color to communicate your meaning. Again, you should still totally use color. Color is great. Color is a great way of communicating meaning. Just make sure it's not the only way you're communicating meaning. Minimum contrast. This one's related to color choices. The WCAG says at this level, we need to have a minimum contrast ratio between the text and its background. So on my slide here, right, where it says minimum contrast, that's like a almost black text on a very light gray background. We're talking about the contrast between the words minimum contrast and the white background. This is really important for low vision and colorblind users. It also benefits people who have their device like turned to really low brightness, a poor quality monitor. This is easy to do unless you have really strict brand colors. Then this is going to be it's going to be difficult because you're going to need to push back against the brand colors you've established. Tools for this. I won't go too deep into it because you can refer to these links afterwards, but I've given you 2 resources you can use to check the color contrast of your website, both using a browser extension, but also one here that you can use to color pick anything you see on your screen, and it will tell you if they have enough contrast. And one of these will even give recommendations on how to fix it. That's awesome. Next, this is another pretty common one. We can't have text in an image unless it's absolutely essential to how it looks, like a logo, right? Your logo can be an image of text, but you don't want to have like a screenshot of text on your site, or what's another common one? Like an infographic, but really it's just some colorful text that's in an image. No good. This is a problem for low vision users who need to zoom in. Everything will get pixelated. It's also a big problem for people who rely on a screen reader because they can't access the text in there. Also, if you have a visual tracking problem or a reading disability, it makes things really difficult. This is actually really easy to fix. Just don't put text in an image unless your site design for some reason requires images of text. I've worked with clients before. Specifically, I see this a lot with performing arts groups. Where instead of having, maybe here's the musical for next season, right? Instead of putting the information just directly on the page, they will just upload an image of like the flyer of the event with the date and the how to get tickets and everything. And it's in an image, which means it's inaccessible. No good. If you can use text to have the same visual effect, do it. So in that poster example, instead of having it in an image, just type that directly on the page. If you have to have text in an image for some reason, such as a logo, put that in your alt text. And if the text in an image is a part of other visual content, that's fine, like a graph or a diagram or something. That's not a big deal. I'm also realizing I'm running out of time a little bit. I actually have several more examples like these for you, but I don't want to give you absolutely no time for questions. So, like we said, these slides are going to be sent out. I apologize for running low on time. Other things you have to look forward to as a teaser, you can read about. You shouldn't have content that's moving that people can't pause. You need to identify errors clearly for people. You need to have labels and instructions on your page. Oh, I only had 3 I didn't have time for. That's fine. So we talked about how do we create an accessibility process, how you might ask for help, and how to create accessible content. I gave you a teaser of that. You can take a look at these slides for those 3 additional examples. And of course, those links I gave you to read the WCAG yourself and other resources on quick fixes. Thank you so much all for coming. I will imagine you're applauding. And I have a few short minutes here for any other questions you might have. Of course, do feel free to send along questions if for some reason you have to leave immediately. But thank you all again for coming. Yes, and thank you. I should remind you this. Yes, so we will be sending out to the email you used to register for this event. You will be getting a link to these lovely slides. So thank you, Anne. And I believe there will also be a recording emailed. And everybody says thank you and clap, clap, clap. It's the one downside of the webinar, right? You don't get the applause moment. Okay, cool. Well, just for the sake of respecting everyone's time, again, these slides will be sent out, and do feel free to send along any questions that maybe I didn't cover well or anything like that for you. As somebody asked me, you can contact us directly if you have a question. I believe there should be a contact information in that email you get. So thank you so much, everybody, again. We really appreciate you coming, and feel free to respond to that email if you have any questions at all. Thank you all so much for coming, and good luck making your websites accessible.